It's time for Bag Lab.
All right, so tonight's Bag Lab question was from Terry, and Terry emailed me. She says, "Hi Sarah, hope you are doing well. I was wondering if you could demonstrate how to do darts correctly. Either they look like pointy boobs or there are gaps at the top of the dart. I know practice makes perfect, but I'm practicing how to do it wrong. Any help would be greatly appreciated." So, Terry, we've got you covered. I'm going to discuss in my demonstration a quick way to sew darts, and also two different ways with different ways to stitch them as well. So enjoy the demonstration. Today we're going to be talking about darts, and I'm using the free Oreo bag pattern and video, the pattern piece from that project, because it has a dart. I'm using that for this demonstration to show a few different methods for marking and assembling your darts, and also stitching them, in particular this pointed edge over here. So I went ahead, before I proceed with the demonstration, I wanted to show you what the dart actually looks like in a finished bag. This is the Oreo bag, and this front of the bag was that pattern piece that I was just sharing. These two stitched portions, this is what the assembled dart looks like. So depending on the pattern that you're working from, the dart might look slightly different, but in general, they usually form some sort of a triangle piece. Oftentimes the triangle ends at the top, and these are called dart legs. The dart legs are what we'll be using for placing the fabric right sides together. So I went ahead and cut out my fabric and interfacing. I'm just using a quilting cotton and a foam interfacing for my example. So before I get into the two different methods for assembling the darts, I wanted to share with you, and just ignore these two markings for now. I just wanted to share with you how I would normally sew and prepare a dart, just because I like to move through it a little bit quicker. We'll be folding the fabric right sides together, and I'm placing the two dart legs, which is this portion at the top, directly on top of each other. So I usually pin that part first, and because the fabric, as you can see, it normally gets a bit bunched up underneath, I normally like to take my finger and drag it through, especially this portion over here where the two dart lines intersect. Make sure that's nice and smooth, and place a few wonder clips, especially the wonder clip past this point over here. That one's super important for keeping everything smooth. So I'll pin everything, and then I'll sew. Depending on the pattern that you're working with, you'll either be sewing directly on top of the line, or you'll be sewing a 1/4 of an inch away from the line is the usual seam allowance. So now that I've shown you this quick way to sew a dart, I wanted to talk through a couple different methods for securing the fabric a little bit better before stitching the dart, and also removing this extra fabric ahead of time. So what I'm normally doing is I'm normally stitching the dart, and then I'm trimming the seam allowance. We're going to trim the seam allowance first, and then we're actually going to sew the dart for this particular example. So I'm going to talk through two different methods, and I've marked them over here just so we can keep track while we're working through. So the dart on the left, I'm working with the basis of, we're going to be stitching the dart on the line, and the dart on the right, we're going to be sewing using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So that means we're going to be sewing a 1/4 of an inch away from the line. Those are the two different ways you'll generally see darts represented in a pattern, either stitching on the line or using a seam allowance. And this dart placement is from the dart that I cut out from my pattern piece, and I just marked it on the wrong side of the fabric. So for this particular method first, we're going to be completing some top stitching. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine. I'm going to use a lengthened stitch length. So on my machine, that's 4 millimeters. And I'm going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from the line on the inside of the dart. So I'm going to take that over to the sewing machine now. Okay, so because we're going to be stitching directly on top of this purple line, that will leave us with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So I'm going to take my ruler and with this green pen, I'm going to draw a line that is 1/4 of an inch away from the purple line. And this method was actually posted a couple years ago by Iris in our So Sweetness Facebook group. Okay, so now because the fabric is secured with that top stitching, I'm going to go ahead and cut on the green line. And again, this is only for the method where you're sewing the dart on the line from that pattern piece. So those pink stitches kind of help keep everything secure and nice and flat. And the reason that we're cutting this fabric away is to remove extra bulk while we're sewing. And because we measured this and we know that it's exactly 1/4 of an inch away from the stitching line, we can actually just go ahead and place the fabrics right sides together. You want to especially make sure that that V is smoothed out. And all you need to do is actually place the fabrics right sides together. You don't need to fiddle with if my dart is on top of each other, if the two lines are on top of each other. We know they are because we already used our ruler to mark. So I'm going to use my Wonder Clips to hold everything in place. And because this is the example where we're sewing the dart on top of the line, we're going to do just that. We're going to sew on top of that purple line that we drew, which is what we transferred from the paper pattern piece. Okay, and I turned my stitch length back to my regular stitch length, and on my machine that's 2.5 millimeters. Okay, so this is what we just sewed here, and then from the right side of the fabric, when you kind of push that out, this is what the dart will look like. Okay, so for this second demonstration, I'm going to be working with, assuming that the pattern instructions call for sewing 1/4 of an inch or whatever the seam allowance is away from the dart line. So visually what that means is when the dart legs are lined up, you'll be sewing, in this instance, 1/4 of an inch away from the line that we used when we traced placement from the paper pattern piece, which is what this is right here. So assuming that we're using the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, I'm going to take my orange friction pen and I'm going to draw 1/4 of an inch away from either end. This will be our stitching line, and it's not necessary to actually draw stitching lines every time, but I find that at least for this demonstration, it's helpful to visually see what we're doing before we actually take it over to the sewing machine and stitch. Okay, so I just lengthened both of those a little bit so that they come closer to meeting. And so what we're going to do here, and I'm going to mark in red, is because we'll be cutting away at our original line, because this is our stitching line, we're going to top stitch in between. So about 1/8 of an inch away from either line. It doesn't matter, you choose, it'll be right down the middle. So I'm going to increase my stitch length to 4 millimeters for this top stitching, and I'm going to sew 1/8 of an inch away from the purple line, basically right down the middle. Okay, so because the orange line is the stitching line, we're going to be cutting away directly on top of the original line that we drew, which is marked in purple. And the old adage, what is it, measure twice, cut once. So you want to be very sure that you have a handle on what you're cutting before you cut it. Okay, so because we marked the stitching line, it's very easy to go ahead and place the fabric right sides together again where the V is. You want to just make sure that that's nice and smooth first. And because we've been measuring as we go along, it'll be easy to just sew this 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, or because we have that drawn line, you can sew directly on top of the drawn line. Okay, so I've set my stitch length to my usual, which on my machine is 2.5 millimeters. I'm going to show you a little bit of a different option for finishing the end where the point meets. So in that first example, I just backstitched where I reached the end. For this example, about 1/4 of an inch away from the end, basically where the fabric is folded, I'm going to stop, decrease my stitch length to about 1/2 millimeter, and then just sew that last 1/4 of an inch with that decreased stitch length. This just gives you a different option if you prefer not to backstitch, or if you feel like your machine doesn't give you good results when you've backstitched darts in the past. Okay, so I'm about 1/4 of an inch away from the fold. I'm going to decrease my stitch length to about 1/4 of an inch, and I'm just going to sew that last 1/4 of an inch. It goes very slowly. Just sew to the fold. Now I'm going to leave my presser foot down. I'm going to lift my needle. Now I'm going to lift the presser foot just maybe about 1/4 of an inch. I'm just going to shift it back a little bit, and within the seam allowance, basically closer to the fold, I'm going to bring the needle down and then stitch that last little area. So this just gives you an option if you'd prefer not to backstitch. This kind of locks that stitch in place instead. Okay, so this is the one we just sewed, and this is what it looks like from the right side of the fabric. As you can see, nice and smooth. This is the first one that we made, also nice and smooth. So this just gives you 2 different options, again, depending on what the pattern is using that you're working for, sewing directly on top of the dart line or sewing using a certain seam allowance. In this example, it was 1/4 of an inch. So let me know if you've tried any of these for your darts, and it's never a bad idea to practice. You can make a little prototype like I've done here with the Oriole bag template, and practice your darts on some fabric or interfacing. All right, we're back. I hope you enjoyed that demonstration. And while the demonstration was playing, I noticed a few questions coming in about the darts, so I wanted to answer those immediately following the demonstration. Elaine wanted to know, aren't you altering the size of the bag by increasing the depth of the dart by 1/4 of an inch? That's a great question. So here's my original sample over here. This one's the half that I sewing on top of the line for the dart. And this one is the one that I sewed using the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. As you can see, this one's longer. So the reason I wanted to give the 2 different demonstrations, because some patterns will have in the instructions that you are to sew on the line for the dart, and some patterns will have a different method for sewing using a certain seam allowance, say 1/4 of an inch. So I wanted to demonstrate both of those, but you'll want to follow your pattern instructions. I'm assuming you're working from a pattern just because drafting a pattern piece with darts is fairly complicated as far as pattern pieces go. So you'll want to make sure you follow the instructions for the project that you're working on, and then go with whatever technique that the instructions call for. But I wanted to demonstrate both of those just so that you would have your choice of whichever one as far as the instructions go that you're working from. Julie says, do you normally cut away the bulk? I've never done that. So my very first part of the video was how I would quickly and normally sew darts, stitching the dart in place first and then trimming the seam allowance back. The second majority part of the demonstration was me cutting away the seam allowance with the seam allowance intact, cutting away first and then stitching. So either will work. Your end result for them will be just about the same. You're just about in all cases, you're not leaving that extra fabric. You're always cutting that away because then you have a huge bulky area in the finished bag. Mary says, I so love and appreciate you, Sarah and Danny, for your kind way of teaching and helping me understand. You both are amazing and greatly appreciated. So happy that you enjoyed that, and we really love what we do, definitely. Julie says, I always draw the stitching lines. It helps me sew good darts. Yeah, that's a great tip. And there's never a problem sewing your stitching lines, even if you're not sewing darts, even if you're sewing, say, a zipper in place. No worries about sewing the stitching line, and if it helps you, then it's a good thing. Linda says, when would you use the second method that you showed in Bag Lab? So kind of similar to Elaine's question, you'll want to reference your pattern instructions and go with the method that you're using, that they're using in the instructions. Kathy says, I love learning. Seriously, I do. Great Bag Lab.
I also love learning, honestly, for stuff that's interesting to yourself. As far as technology, I love learning about technology and different tools and unique applications and stuff like that.
There's always something to learn about really anything. So Joan says, I'm guessing the pattern directions would say how to do the dart. Yes, for sure. Linda says, I learned so much from your demos. Thank you for taking the time to help us. Thank you, Linda. All right, so that concludes Bag Lab, but we'll be back again in 2 weeks with another Bag Lab. So again, instructions for Bag Lab submissions are in the description of the show.